when DeSantis demanded that schools open. We had 3 kids in public school and a wife in public school. And if you had read the coverage, if you had paid attention to social media, you would have thought that this was it. Like, kids were gonna die. Right. And that didn't happen.
America's elected leaders work on a very public stage, monitored by the nation's media. Today, one of the media's best weighs in on the 2022 campaigns, the media itself, and the potential case of the century. Welcome to 13th and Park.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
We will make America strong again.
We will get through this together.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Justin, I've been looking forward to this. I don't know about you. Marc Caputo, who has spent the better part of 20 years covering our favorite subject, politics and government, right? Starting with the Miami Herald for 12 years. He went to Politico. He popularized something called Caputo Cam. You always want to be careful about being on Caputo Cam. He did the Florida Playbook for 4 years, which was must reading. It was like the Bible for insiders in Florida and beyond. And from there, I should say, backing up, a University of Miami Hurricane. And the one thing I know about Marc Caputo, as do you,
Hurricanes.
The one thing I know is that Marc Caputo has probably created his own hurricanes at times as he starts to report on government and politics. But the one thing also that I want to point out to everybody is that he is one of the very few, I think, in media that really treads that very delicate middle line between, competing partisans and warring ideologues. And so when you read his stuff, I mean, I find myself as a writer wanting to emulate some of his style because it's tremendously entertaining, interesting, timely, and truthful, which is something you don't see a lot in politics. So welcome to the show.
We should end the interview here because it's only going to get. There's no way it can get better. It can only get worse.
Thank you, Marc, for joining us.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
Justin?
Yeah, thanks, Marc, for joining us. Well, you're currently at NBC News, and it's one of the most respected, well-regarded news organizations, legendary with Meet the Press, and has a storied history. So I'm curious to know, you've had, as Adam said, you've worked at other news organizations. What's it like working for NBC News? And if you can give us a sense of the day in the life of a reporter there.
Well, I'm NBC Digital, right? I'm not. I have a face for radio. So I'm not one of the TV people. I mean, I do some TV stuff, but it's very similar to what I had done at Politico. Politico was when I had made the full transition over into a kind of a fully digital kind of internet only reporter. Although technically that really happened at the Miami Herald. I almost put the date on it. What was it like? Well, actually, I can't put the date on it because I can't remember it. But 2005 or so, the Miami Herald stopped delivering in Tallahassee. And that was kind of a big thing. And, that early 2000s period, the early aughts, is when newspapers circulation really starts to just crater. And we become more and more online. So, I mean, the daily life, it's hard for me to describe the daily life because I do it regularly. I'm always kind of working on about 3 stories simultaneously and working different people and talking to different people. Sometimes it's reactive. Trump filings, the Trump case, that's like they filed something, we have to write about it. I'm not the lead writer on the justice system at NBC News. That's Ryan Riley, my colleague, who does a lot of that great work. But for me, I kind of tread a few worlds. Currently, it's Trump and Senate, and then some kind of more global or national politics. Abortion is something I'm going to finally have to write about. I haven't really written about abortion politics in a long time, but now it's coming of it's just so unavoidable, right? But yeah, to put a finer point on that answer, So the daily life is started what 6:30 or 7. Start looking at Twitter, getting caught up on the emails, get my kids to school. And by then I'm already into the day and making calls and working on my next story. Probably write an average of I try to do about an average of 3 stories a week. It's, for me, it's just like the essence of an art is preserved in its constant practice. It's not to say I'm an artist, but it's just kind of one of those things that just kind of helps me just stay in rhythm. Rhythm's very important.
Right. So for the non-reactive stories, where do those story ideas come from? Do they come from your editor? Do someone pitch you on a story? Do you just see something on Twitter and decide, this looks like interesting. Let me try to pursue that. Where do the non-reactive story ideas come from?
Yeah. So that, self-generated would be one. I see something, I hear something, I read something, not necessarily on Twitter, but the reality is a lot of stuff flows through Twitter. Twitter's dangerous for reporters, by the way. I mean, I'm a person who, in my past employment, had a number of problems, both from the left and the right on Twitter. As a mainstream media reporter, when you're forced to apologize, it always generates headlines. So, my kids can now Google me and tell me I've been canceled a few times. Thanks, kids. But nevertheless, Twitter is a fantastic news source. The problem with Twitter, in part, is the conversation base for a mainstream media reporter. The Pew Research had done a study about Twitter and found that it's overwhelmingly liberal-leaning in its user base and in the volume of tweets produced by those users. So there is a certain amount of liberal bias kind of built into it. I'm not saying liberal bias is bad. It's just, that's not something I want to engage in, either that or conservative bias or any other sort of bias. Nevertheless, it's like kind of an instantaneous news service. It's amazing. So yeah, Twitter is a place where you'll just kind of spot things and spot trends or spot other stories. But beyond that, if you read something someone else had written that you think is interesting, you start following it, or I'm following something on my beat, I'll be sort of mining them. Second thing is, it's campaign season. The dirty little secret that a lot of citizens, viewers, readers at home don't realize is that the political campaigns, the political parties on both sides have a vast infrastructure of opposition research. And they're just constantly trying to dish this onto reporters. And the idea is they have like a negative hit on a candidate, and they'll want you to write about it. By the way, the Democrats have done a much better job in the opposition research department than the Republicans this cycle. It's also partly a function probably of some of the Republican candidates have like a target-rich history,
background
Walker with domestic violence and the like. So, I usually don't take oppo pitches because they're usually dangerous. They're slanted and they get you in trouble.
Right.
But once in a while, that'll be something. Or I'll mind someone like, look, if you want me to write this story, okay, I'll use this part of it that's true. But I want to write the story behind the story. How are you using this? Right? What is I'm a political reporter. I cover campaigns. What are the mechanics of how this gets used? And then then there's just editor-driven stories that will say, hey, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. And your first answer, at least mine after 20 years, is always make sure your first answer is yes, even if you don't want to. And then maybe you can kill it through abuse and neglect. But so those are usually things self-generated, the other, and tips, and then this.
So Mark, let's talk about the former president. You just did a piece talking about Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice. I thought it was brilliantly written. And you talk about sourcing when you source like Eric Holder. Saying, the AG is not a monastery, unconnected to the world that surrounds them, yet your primary responsibility is to enforce the law. Your piece kind of, I think, puts the reader and the viewer into the shoes of Merrick Garland and understanding how difficult the situation he faces and even contemplating a possible indictment of a former president beyond just the matters of law and venue. But in terms of the real, practical concept of how is it going to look, how is it going to play, what can you do if you're moving down that pike to do both of those well without invoking the scorn of those who are cheering one way or the other.
Well, you said it well. It's I don't think anyone envies Merrick Garland. The reason we wrote that, by the way, Ryan Riley, my colleague at NBC, he was the one who spoke to Eric Holder, the former AG. I had gotten Gonzalez and a number of these other lawyers. Actually, the most interesting lawyer that I interviewed there was Dick Gregory, who had tried Manuel Noriega. And I wasn't writing a legal treatise, but this whole world of what's interesting in the story for me was the whole world of gray mail, not blackmail, but gray mail. How a defendant in a case where there's classified information tries to force as much disclosure as possible, and the government doesn't want it disclosed, right? But the reason we wrote the piece and the reason I was interested in it is don't get me wrong, Mar-a-Lago is very different. The search there is very different. This case is very different from the other cases. But having gone through so many iterations of the Coyote and Roadrunner saga of Donald Trump, where it's like, he's going to get, they're going to get the Roadrunner this time, right? And it doesn't happen. And you see the conversation unfolding on both the airwaves and social media, where you would have figured just yesterday, Donald Trump would be kind of clapped in irons and frog marched off to Devil's Island. And it just hasn't happened. So the question is why? And what is Merrick Garland thinking? How is he doing this?
Right.
And that's what we wanted to kind of get across is hey, sorry, people. The reality is politicians are treated differently by the Justice Department. They always have. There's actually an entire unit devoted to prosecuting politicians. There are rules about when you're supposed to prosecute them or not. There are guidelines, I should say, about that. And there are considerations that any prosecutor makes. Before bringing a case, a prosecutor's like, look, do I have enough evidence to convict? Now, usually it's, do I have enough evidence to support a conviction before an unbiased and reasonable jury? Well, can we really get an unbiased and reasonable jury? What's Merrick Garland thinking about that? And then we could get into these issues of venue. So that's why we wrote that for NBC. I just want to kind of introduce that as just a thing look, this is not an easy decision. Yeah, the facts against Trump look pretty damning. But when you start to peel back the layers, this could be a really complicated case to charge, to try, and to convict.
You're often ahead of the curve. So you wrote a number of pieces, and I'll go back to one you wrote in the early part of 2020, having to do with Governor DeSantis, Mario Cuomo in New York and others. And you started to see something, I think, Mark, that others have not seen until more recent times, which is how Ron DeSantis went from a very smart but relatively unknown leader of a state to a national conversation piece, and why. So take us back into that a little bit, both in what you wrote in the early part of 20, and then going forward when in 2021, you had a very good way, I think, to describe the governor. You use words like red state exemplar. He's wonky but combative. He's intelligent and effective. You put all this together, you get a profile of someone that seems to most to be cut from a different cloth, which makes him so compelling.
And the far left hates me for it. As a result, what you find both the far left and the far right, or the left and the right, especially on social media, if you write anything that's negative about their side, you're obviously biased the other side. If you write anything that's remotely positive about the people they hate you, right? And so DeSantis is a good example of that. What was interesting for me during COVID was listening to DeSantis early on, interviewing experts, and realizing, he was doing some edgy things.
All right.
I think he was pretty laissez-faire about things, and the degree to which he's responsible for deaths, I will let other people try to quantify and argue. But what happened is by May of 2020, and I should have drawn the story up that I had done when I worked at Politico. We had a newsletter they still do called The Nightly, where it's it has a little more voice and there's more analysis in it. And there was this dynamic I was saying where New York had 2-3 times the deaths that Florida did. And the media if you will. I hate that fiction, but it's true.
I know you've chided me for that on Twitter that I use that term.
Yeah, there we go. I'm glad I made that sane.
So now I'm humoring that you're using it now. Thank you.
Yeah, no. I was like, that's for lack of a better term. Well, maybe this gets to like kind of one of these, Paul on the road to Damascus moments. I don't know. I don't want to say I'm Paul or
see the light,
but the media bias from the Acela-based media, New York and DC, was just so plain to me. Because on one hand, you had this one state where all these people were dying from COVID. And the media there was just like, wow, this Governor Cuomo's great because he talked to them. Don't get me wrong. He did a good job in the kind of the PR department. You're talking about the court of public opinion. Cuomo did a great job. DeSantis was just combative and just, thumb in the eye of everyone, middle finger up. And there were far fewer deaths. And yet, if you would, over time, if you would just, as a national political reporter based in Florida, I'm like, what you guys are describing is not what I'm seeing here. And again, I'm not saying DeSantis is flawless. I'm not saying anyone is flawless. I'm not saying his response to COVID was great. I think some of his messaging on vaccines probably could have been a lot better. But nevertheless, in like May of 2020, I finally did this piece like, hey, there's like, you guys are getting this wrong. And like, I'm sorry to say, there's media bias here. Like the New York media loves to love its governor as much as it loves to hate the Florida governor. And incidentally, I have friends who one friend of mine years ago who worked for the New York Times told me when they covered Florida, the one way to get the New York Times editor's attention for a Florida story is to make Florida look ridiculous, which is not difficult to do, right? But nevertheless, like wacky, stupid Florida, like New York loves that. So, that was just a moment where I realized and I would listen to DeSantis. He would make some valid points. A lot of things he said wound up, I think the phrase I used, let me edit that. The phrase I used is that in the end, he was more right than his critics. Because his critics would have had you believe like everyone's going to die. This guy is just vastly irresponsible. And by the time like February of 2021 rolled around, though we had these different, way, like for instance, I remember DeSantis said like in the summer wave of 2020, there was a summer spike. He's like, look, this is seasonal. And a lot of people are like, it's not seasonal. How dare you say that? Then it turned out later on, they're like, yeah, it's seasonal. And then he doubted the efficacies of masks and mask mandates. And they're like, how dare you? And then, the research didn't quite show how well it worked. Now, that having been said, like my wife recently got COVID here in the classroom. She's a school teacher, public school teacher here in Miami. When she got COVID, like we were walking around with masks. So by February of 2021, Florida's death rate was like firmly in the middle of the pack by that of states. We were like 26th or so of like 50 states. And New York was a lot higher. Michigan was higher.
Mm-hmm. So Mark, can we we have to ask you the question. I'm borrowing something actually from Justin's playbook. So we had talked about it before we got you on the show today. The media. Let's go back to the media. Sure. What does the media talk about around the proverbial water cooler as you see that the lack of trust that the public has in media in general has been on a slippery slope for quite a few years now? What do you talk about in terms of the kinds of things that as a group you hope to do more of or better or differently to try to reinstill confidence of trust in the people you're talking to and who follow everything that you're writing and talking about on the air?
I can't say I really talk to colleagues about it or my editors. Like, in the end, you can argue yourself blue in the face or red in the face to use it.
Well played there, Mark. Well played.
Purple in the face.
Purple in the face. But like ultimately, we're in a situation where the United States, the public, the nation is losing faith in all institutions, government, media, church, schools, just across the board. We are an institution just like them. At the same time, with the rise of social media, internet, the decline of newspapers, people can tailor their media diet to their biases. There's a lot of bad faith criticism about the media. I will say I am the recipient of it all the time. And you can check my Twitter feed. It's, one day I'm a DeSantis apologist, and the next day I'm a pro-Chavez socialist, right? It's just pick your day, pick your story. For me, I just try to kind of focus on like, what are the facts? What's the real story here? Sometimes it's going to gore the ox of a Republican. Sometimes it's going to gore the ox of a Democrat. Sometimes it'll do neither, or make them both look bad, or make them both look good. Who knows? But a good example of how we changed in the Trump era was interesting, that we used to if a president said something, he generally said something that was within the kind of the bounds, the hash marks of truth, or we could call them out. Trump really did not obey those rules. And so we used to always write headlines like, president says X, right? And yeah, usually like X there was some sort of it turned out with Trump, he would frequently say X, that's just not true. So we started to use phrases like without evidence or not supported, right? But that in and of itself becomes a slippery slope, because more and more of our critics on the left, in this case, would demand greater and greater certainty. You need to call out all of these different things, and you do. But at a certain point, when you're writing news stories and covering news in real time, weighing in on what is definitely a fact when you don't know what the facts definitely are, and I kind of go back to COVID here and having to rely on the expert class without realizing hey, a lot of these scientists actually have political biases too, right? That helps cost us on the other end. So I think it's an incredibly difficult situation to be in. I'm not asking for people to have any mercy on us or me, because this job is easier than roofing. It's a kind of a privilege to be able to do this. I just try to do it right and fairly. I don't think there's a silver bullet or a magic fix to this. I just think the best thing for us to do is to be accurate, be fair, and be honest, and and also be open-minded. But beyond that, I don't have a good answer for you.
Well, I can say on behalf of Justin, and I hope most of this audience that's listening to this, we appreciate your candor. I mean, because you've always kind of been a straight out guy, and it's not easy being a member of the media these days on any front for any reason. And I think you have to show kind of a mix of understanding and courage to kind of go through the day sometimes. And we really appreciate the fact that from the very beginning, Marc, that you've kind of played it straight out. And usually knowing for all those that know you at about 200 miles an hour. Because
but also remember,
what
right? You perceive as straight out, there are going to be people probably to the left of you who don't think it's straight.
No question. And
right?
As they say, it's like in a negotiation. If both sides are griping, you probably did something right.
Or you're just shitty at your job.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Marc, earlier you pointed out really two facets of this. One is when you talked about the Acela media, the Washington, D.C. Washington, New York media, kind of characterizing kind of the performance of Governor Cuomo in New York and Governor DeSantis in Florida, but it really was mismatched with what was really going on the grounds. There was some kind of inherent bias there that Florida, whatever Florida does, it can't be right. And New York is the best state in the country because we all live here.
Schools were a great example.
Schools were a great example.
My wife is raised in Massachusetts. She's a public school teacher. She is a toe tag liberal, right? She will always vote Democrat. At the time in 2020, when DeSantis demanded that schools open, we had 3 kids in public school and a wife in public school. And if you had read the coverage, if you had paid attention to social media, you would have thought that this was it. Kids were gonna die.
Right.
And that didn't happen. Now, again, not saying DeSantis' COVID response is perfect. I think this is a far harder topic to cover even in an hour podcast, right? Let alone in a news story. But that was a great example of kind of cultural bias from mainstream media defaulting to experts like the big cities of, I mean, it's a big city for our purposes, like the liberal urban areas of DC and New York. The way they perceived COVID was just different. Like, I mean, the reality is like, on the whole, and I'm just guessing this by looking at the polling, Floridians and Republicans were more willing to accept, like, hey, it's a pandemic and people are going to die. Let's get on with our lives. That's pretty fatalistic, right? But they had come to that conclusion sooner, whereas Democratic voters, people more to the left of center, and epidemiologists whose job it is to control disease, they want to stop disease, and they were hoping for zero COVID. And in the end, our political system is not run by scientists. It's run by politicians who weigh what scientists say and sometimes disregard them and sometimes don't.
Right. Well, and the larger point I was making, though, was about how the reality of what's happening in Florida, what happened in Florida, was different from the way Florida was covered. Because when, like you said, when the schools reopened, it was it was widely criticized by the expert class, but the parents were cheering it on, and we saw the political ramifications of that in the state of Virginia in the governor's race last year. So I just kind of make that observation as one of the factors that I believe kind of leads to this mistrust of the media, because people are living their lives on the ground and what they're reading isn't matching their experience, their life experience, and that can become a problem. And the second thing, the other flip side of that coin, is when you said that when you write something positive about a Republican, the Democrats criticize you. You write something negative about a Republican, the Democrats praise you, and vice versa. And I think what's happening is a lot of consumers of information and news, they essentially want to be told, "Tell me I'm right."
Yeah.
And so they don't want to, many consumers of information don't want to be informed. They don't want to hear something good about that is contrary to their worldview.
They just want to be
contrary
right.
and contrary to their team,
or contrary to their team, right? So I think that's a problem on the other side. I think the media has a problem because in many cases they're not really they're mismatching the reality on the ground to what they're reporting, and at the same time, you have a lot of news consumers that essentially want to have their views affirmed.
Right. 2 weeks ago or so, you were asking about stories that come off of Twitter. Scrolling through Twitter, I see Blake Masters is advertising. He's got a new ad up accusing Mark Kelly of lying about abortion. I'm like, this is interesting. Let me see what the ad says. So I drop the ad, and here's Blake Masters. Just got through a Republican primary in Arizona, where the Republican voters are pretty conservative, right? Pretty far right. And the ad talks about how he supports a 15-week period for a woman to get an abortion. And I'm like, what? Like, if you were still running a Republican primary, you ran an ad like that, they would call you pro-choice,
right?
And throw you out of the primary. And now you're like, abortion's good or okay for 15 weeks, right? I was like, wow, that's crazy. I was like, I wonder what his website says. So I quickly go to his website on the issues. There's abortion, and says he supports the personhood amendment. Well, personhood means like life begins the second you're conceived, and anything else after that is murder. So what I do, I made sure to screen cap that. That is, take a picture of it. I called a colleague because I was working on something else, and he did the same thing I did. And then we called the Masters campaign. 15 minutes later, the website has changed. And so we just wrote a story about this is a great example of the dog has caught, the bumper and the car starting to explode on it, right? But the reaction from the right there was like, how dare you write about this? You support killing babies, and you're giving Democrats a pass, and what about Hunter Biden, right? So yeah, that's a good example of that there.
So Marc Caputo, who for all those to follow Marc, and you should, because his stuff is as I said earlier, is timely, interesting, well researched, and generally on the mark. I'll say generally on the mark. Your Twitter handle is at Marc A. Caputo. I like your description on your Twitter's site, national political reporter, NBC News, Florida man. I'm glad that Florida still is a part of your life. We really appreciate you being a part of this, Mark. Continue to do what you do so well. I think, an informed America is a strong America.
Thank you, Mark. Great
Thank
to
you,
have
guys.
you on the show.
Wow. I mean,
Could have gone for another hour with Mark.
he's something, isn't he?
Yeah, a lot of ground to cover.
A lot of people really take shots at the media, and it's understandable, right? Some is very legitimate. Some of it's born out of frustration. But Mark is one of those players that always gives you the feeling he wants to get it right.
Right.
And he'll dig 3 times deeper than most to try to get there.
Right. And I think that, I don't know, I hate to use this term, but it's true. Very open-minded. In other words, very receptive, if whichever way. And he said it, sometimes I'm going to gore the Republicans' ox, sometimes I'm going to gore the Democrats' ox. And there are some reporters who, are a little bit more guarded about goring one party or the other's ox. And so that's why I really have to give Mark credit for that. And just has really, really, really good insights. And look, he was willing to call out, which I was kind of, it was remarkable, the Acela media is the term that's used to talk about reporters in Washington and New York. The Acela corridor after the Amtrak train that connects the two cities. So, I give him credit for that. And I really wanted to kind of dive deeper with him on that in terms of, that's one of the reasons, this disconnect between what people are experiencing. And then he actually shared from his own experience, which, again, I give Mark credit for. But he's willing to kind of look critically at the coverage, the news coverage that he's also a consumer of with respect to his wife. And the way when DeSantis opened up the schools, it was widely criticized in the news media, but the parents were cheering and like, yes, we need our kids back in school. And the point I didn't make on the podcast too is now we've had research that's come out that's shown that the students whose schools were closed the longest tended to be from more underserved areas.
Exactly.
And those students have actually, according to the National Assessment of Educational Process, the nation's educational report card, those students of color have now fallen back and they've regressed in terms of their progression. So, that's kind of another interesting point that I think goes to the disconnect between what was happening in Florida with reopening schools and the benefits that's had and the way it was covered. And kudos to Mark for being willing to acknowledge that.
We talked to him also about that story Jess wrote about Merrick Garland.
Right.
Again, you had to read that story to really appreciate, wow, if you're in Merrick Garland's shoes, what the heck do you do? I mean, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you do, right?
Right.
It's like there's no way out. That's going to be easy, regardless of the merits of the case, regardless of any other consideration. But people like Mark not only get it, they can articulate that. And I think that's very important. As I said at the end of the show, being informed is like kind of at the heart of our strength as a democracy.
Right.
We need that kind of reporting. This is the kind of person, even if you hate some of the things he writes,
Right.
that you're rooting for because we need quality there.
Well, sure. And that's a very nuanced story because most of the coverage that I'm seeing about the Justice Department deliberations tend to be more, well, how much closer are we to indicting Trump? How much closer are we? And basically there's an inherent bias in there about Trump's going to be indicted. It's just a question of when. But that piece that Mark wrote shows that it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion, that there are other factors that are considered. And if you go back and if you look at the James Comey press conference that he had about Hillary Clinton and her handling of certain documents, those were the considerations that James Comey had to make when he had to decide whether to charge Hillary Clinton, who at the time was a presidential candidate for president of the United States. And it's not an easy decision. It wasn't a black and white decision then. It's not a black and white decision now.
Thanks for joining us again on 13th and Park. We are going to continue to report out information through others that are kind of giving it to us straight. And it's really important, Justin, right, that people make up their own minds about what to do about the information and the news that they're receiving, as opposed to being structured or lectured or told what to do. And I hope 13th and Park is going to be one of those places that you can go to kind of get the skinny on what's happening, and then you make the call.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Great
Nice
show.
being with you.